They had no idea the man behind the wheel of that hearse had driven through actual war zones, but they were about to find out what happens when you block a veteran's final mission. Marcus Rodriguez adjusted his black tie in the rearview mirror of the pristine 2019 Cadillac Hearse, the same way he used to check his gear before a convoy mission in Afghanistan. Some habits die hard, and in Marcus's line of work, attention to detail wasn't just professional pride, it was a sacred duty. At 52, his salt and pepper hair was cropped in a regulation fade that he'd never quite abandoned, and his dark eyes held the steady calm of a man who'd seen enough chaos to appreciate order. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Rodriguez family funeral services. The business Marcus had built from nothing after hanging up his Army uniform 8 years ago. The transition from staff sergeant to funeral director might have seemed like a strange career pivot to most people. But to Marcus, it made perfect sense. Both jobs required precision, respect for protocol, and an unwavering commitment to getting people home safely. The only difference was the final destination. Every funeral is a final mission, Marcus often told his staff, and no mission gets left incomplete. It wasn't just a motivational slogan painted on the break room wall. It was the core philosophy that had made Rodriguez Family Funeral Services the most trusted name in the county. When families were facing their darkest hours, they knew Marcus would handle their loved ones with the same meticulous care he'd once applied to protecting his fellow soldiers. The business occupied a modest but dignified building on Elm Street, with a facade of warm brick and tasteful landscaping that conveyed both professionalism and compassion. Marcus had designed every detail himself, from the peaceful meditation garden where families could find a moment of solitude, to the garage bay where he personally maintained the fleet of vehicles. The hearse gleaming in the morning light was his pride and joy, a vehicle he'd modified with military precision to ensure every ride was smooth, silent, and respectful. This particular Tuesday morning carried extra weight. In the back of the hearse lay Sergeant Tommy Chun, 28 years old, whose life had been cut short in a training accident at Fort Hood just 5 days earlier. Marcus had never met Tommy in life, but he'd spent the past week learning everything about the young soldier. His childhood in San Antonio, his deployment to Iraq, his plans to propose to his girlfriend when he returned from training. In Marcus's experience, understanding the person behind the uniform was essential to honoring their memory properly. The Chin family had specifically requested Marcus handle their son's funeral after hearing about his reputation in the veteran community. Tommy's father, a Vietnam veteran himself, had looked Marcus in the eye during their first meeting and said, "I know you'll bring my boy home with honor." That handshake had sealed more than a business agreement. It was a solemn promise between two men who understood the weight of service. Marcus's approach to military funerals was legendary among local veterans. He'd studied the regulations until he could recite them from memory, coordinated with honor guards across 3 counties, and personally trained his staff on proper flag-folding techniques. But beyond the technical aspects, Marcus brought something extra to these services, an understanding that came from having worn the uniform himself, from having said goodbye to brothers in arms on foreign soil. His own military service had been a study in contradictions. 2 tours in Afghanistan as a convoy security specialist, navigating IE-laden roads and hostile territory with ice-cold professionalism, followed by quiet moments of devastating loss when friends didn't make it home. Marcus had earned 3 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, decorations that now sat in a simple frame in his office, not as trophies, but as reminders of the price of freedom and the weight of responsibility. The skills he'd learned in the Army translated perfectly to his civilian mission. Route planning, logistics coordination, crisis management under pressure, all essential whether you were moving supplies through enemy territory or ensuring a funeral procession moved with dignity through city traffic. The attention to detail that had kept his convoys safe now ensured that grieving families never had to worry about a single aspect of their loved one's final journey. Marcus's reputation extended far beyond his technical competence. The veteran community had adopted him as one of their own, not just because of his service record, but because of how he honored their fallen brothers and sisters. He'd never charged full price for a veteran's funeral, never rushed a family through their grief, and never failed to ensure that military honors were rendered with perfect precision. Word of mouth in the tight-knit veteran community was better than any advertising, and Marcus's calendar stayed full with families who specifically sought him out. The funeral home's staff reflected Marcus's values. Elena Vasquez, his assistant director, was the widow of a Marine killed in Iraq. James Mitchell, who handled logistics, was a Navy veteran who'd served on submarines. Sarah Kim, their grief counselor, had lost her brother in Afghanistan and understood the unique challenges military families faced. Together, they formed a team that understood service, sacrifice, and the sacred nature of their work. As Marcus performed his final pre-mission checks on the Hearse, tire pressure, fluid levels, communication systems, his mind was already mapping the route to Arlington Memorial Cemetery. Downtown traffic could be unpredictable, but he'd driven these streets hundreds of times. He knew every traffic light, every potential bottleneck, every alternate route. Today's procession would include 12 vehicles carrying family members, an honor guard from Fort Sam Houston, and escort from the local VFW chapter. It was Marcus's job to ensure they all arrived together, on time, and with dignity intact. The morning briefing with the staff had covered every detail: departure time, vehicle order, radio procedures, contingency plans. Marcus ran his operation with military efficiency, but his team understood that beneath the precision lay a deep compassion for the families they served. Today's mission was particularly important, not just because every mission mattered, but because Marcus sensed something in the Chun family's grief that reminded him of his own losses in Afghanistan. As he climbed into the driver's seat of the Hearse, Marcus had no way of knowing that his carefully planned route would intersect with a crowd of protesters who had chosen that same intersection for their demonstration. He couldn't have predicted that his reputation for handling difficult situations would be tested in a way that had nothing to do with traffic or logistics, and everything to do with the collision between civilian activism and military honor. The clock on the dashboard read 10:47 a.m. as Marcus started the engine. Sergeant Tommy Chin's final mission was about to begin, and Marcus Rodriguez, veteran, funeral director, and guardian of the fallen, was about to face the most challenging convoy of his career. Sergeant Tommy Chin should have been home by Thursday. That's what he'd told his girlfriend Maria during their last video call, his boyish grin filling the laptop screen as he talked about the ring he'd hidden in his barracks locker and his plans to propose at their favorite restaurant overlooking the San Antonio River. Instead, a training exercise at Fort Hood had gone catastrophically wrong, and now Tommy was coming home in Marcus Rodriguez's Hearse, wrapped in the flag he'd sworn to defend. Marcus had studied Tommy's file for hours, the way he used to study intelligence reports before dangerous missions. 28 years old, born and raised in San Antonio's East Side, the first person in his family to graduate college. Tommy had enlisted after September 11th, driven by the same sense of duty that had motivated Marcus's generation, but his path had been different. Where Marcus was all business and military bearing, Tommy had been the unit joker, the guy who could make everyone laugh during the worst moments of deployment. The photos Tommy's mother had shared painted a picture of a young man who'd never quite lost his childhood enthusiasm despite seeing combat in Iraq. There was Tommy at his high school graduation, beaming next to his proud parents. Tommy in his dress blues at his promotion ceremony, trying to look serious but failing to suppress a smile. Tommy with his arm around Maria at last year's fiesta, both of them laughing at something off camera. Each image was a reminder of the life that had been cut short, the future that would never unfold. Marcus had met with the Chun family 3 times since Tommy's body arrived at Dover Air Force Base. The first meeting had been purely procedural, paperwork, arrangements, the logistics of bringing their son home. But by the third meeting, Marcus had become something more than a funeral director to the Chun family. He'd become Tommy's advocate, the person who would ensure their son received every honor he'd earned through his service. Tommy's father, David Chun, was a quiet man who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam before returning home to build a successful construction business. During their second meeting, David had pulled Marcus aside and spoken in the direct way that veterans often use with each other. "My son died serving his country, David had said, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly. I need to know that his funeral will reflect that. I need to know that people will understand what kind of man he was. Marcus had made a promise that day, the same promise he made to every military family. Tommy's funeral would be perfect. Not just professional or appropriate, but perfect in every detail that mattered. The flag would be folded with crisp precision. The honor guard would render their honors with military bearing. The route to the cemetery would be planned to avoid any possibility of delay or disruption. Tommy Chun would receive the farewell he'd earned through his service and sacrifice. The planning for Tommy's funeral had consumed Marcus's attention for the past week. The route from the funeral home to Arlington Memorial Cemetery was 12 miles through the heart of downtown, a journey that would normally take 25 minutes but could stretch longer with a full procession. Marcus had driven the route 4 times at different hours, timing traffic lights and identifying potential problem areas. He'd coordinated with the police department for escort services and with Arlington Memorial for the graveside ceremony. Tommy's unit from Fort Hood would provide the honor guard, 7 soldiers in dress uniforms who would carry their fallen brother to his final resting place. Marcus had spoken with their sergeant 3 times, going over every detail of the ceremony. The flag would be removed from the casket with reverent precision, folded 13 times in the ancient military tradition, and presented to Tommy's mother with the words that had comforted grieving military families for generations. On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. The funeral would draw veterans from across the region. Word had spread through the informal networks that connected former soldiers, VFW posts, American Legion chapters, motorcycle clubs, and social media groups. Marcus estimated that more than 200 veterans would attend, many of them wearing their dress uniforms for the first time in years. For the veteran community, Tommy's funeral represented something more than the loss of one young soldier. It was a reminder of their own mortality, their own service, and the bonds that connected them to each other and to those who would never come home. Marcus understood this weight because he'd carried it himself since leaving the Army. Every veteran's funeral was personal, a reminder of friends lost in Afghanistan and the randomness of survival in combat zones. But Tommy's death hit differently because it had happened during training on American soil in what should have been a safe environment. It reminded every veteran that danger could find them anywhere, that the price of service extended beyond combat deployments. The procession would include 12 vehicles carrying family members, friends, and fellow soldiers. Maria would ride in the first car behind the hearse, still wearing the engagement ring Tommy had given her in a brief ceremony at the hospital before he died. Tommy's parents would follow in the second car, flanked by his 2 younger sisters who had flown in from college for the funeral. Behind them would be Tommy's grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, 3 generations of a family saying goodbye to their brightest star. Marcus had personally inspected every vehicle in the procession, checking tire condition, fuel levels, and communication equipment. The last thing Tommy's family needed was a mechanical breakdown or communication failure during their son's final journey. Every driver had been briefed on the route, the protocol for stops, and the importance of maintaining the dignity of the procession. As Tuesday morning arrived, Marcus felt the familiar pre-mission focus settling over him. Tommy Chun deserved a perfect farewell, and Marcus Rodriguez was going to deliver it. He had no way of knowing that 12 miles away, another group was preparing for their own kind of mission, one that would test everything Marcus had learned about leadership, patience, and the power of quiet dignity under pressure. Sarah Winters had never intended to become a professional activist, but life has a way of choosing your battles for you. At 34, she possessed the kind of fierce intelligence and unwavering moral conviction that could either change the world or burn it down, depending on which side of her cause you found yourself. This Tuesday morning, as she stood in the parking lot of the Riverside Community Center checking items off her clipboard, Sarah was convinced she was on the right side of history. The cause that had consumed Sarah's life for the past 6 months was both personal and political. The City Council's recent decision to cut funding for veteran mental health services by 40% had hit close to home. too close. Her brother Jake, a Marine who'd done 3 tours in Iraq, had been using those services to cope with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. When the funding disappeared, so did Jake's counselor, his support group, and his access to specialized therapy. 2 weeks later, Jake had attempted suicide in his apartment bathroom, saved only by a neighbor who heard the gunshot and called 911. Sarah had channeled her rage and grief into action, forming the Coalition for Veteran Justice and launching a campaign to restore the funding. What started as angry posts on social media had evolved into a sophisticated grassroots organization with over 800 members, regular meetings, and a growing reputation for effective advocacy. Sarah had discovered she had a talent for organizing people, for turning individual anger into collective action, for making politicians uncomfortable enough to listen. The protest plan for this Tuesday had been weeks in the making. Sarah's coalition had obtained all the necessary permits, coordinated with local media, and mobilized supporters from across the metropolitan area. The location, the busy intersection of Commerce and Broadway downtown, had been chosen for maximum visibility. During the lunch hour, thousands of commuters would pass through that intersection, creating the perfect audience for their message about the city's betrayal of its veterans. Sarah's team had arrived at dawn to begin setup. Miguel Rodriguez, her second-in-command and a Gulf War veteran himself, had organized the logistics with military precision. Tables were arranged for petition signing, banners were strung between light poles, and a portable sound system was tested and retested. The message was simple but powerful. Our veterans served us. Now we must serve them. Sarah had spent hours crafting that slogan, understanding that in the age of social media, movements lived or died by their ability to distill complex issues into memorable phrases. The core organizers included a mix of veterans, family members, and concerned citizens who shared Sarah's outrage about the funding cuts. There was Linda Martinez, whose husband had lost his leg in Afghanistan and relied on the services that were being eliminated. Frank Williams, a Vietnam veteran who'd become an advocate after his own struggles with PTSD decades earlier. Jennifer Park, a social worker who'd seen firsthand how the cuts would affect her clients. Each had their own story, their own reason for standing in the street on a Tuesday morning, their own investment in the outcome. Sarah's background as a high school history teacher had taught her the power of narrative and symbolism in creating social change. The protest signs weren't just cardboard and marker. They were carefully designed to tell stories. Photos of local veterans who would be affected by the cuts. Statistics about suicide rates among veterans. Quotes from city council members defending their decision alongside facts about their own salaries and benefits. Sarah understood that changing minds required more than chanting slogans. It required making abstract policy decisions feel personal and immediate. The timing of the protest had been calculated for maximum impact. Tuesday was the day before the city council's monthly meeting, when they would have one last chance to reconsider their decision. The lunch hour would maximize foot traffic and media attention. The location would force commuters to confront the issue whether they wanted to or not. Sarah had learned that comfortable people rarely demanded change, so her job was to make people uncomfortable with the status quo. As the morning progressed, supporters began arriving in steady streams. Veterans in faded military surplus jackets stood next to suburban mothers pushing strollers. College students with homemade signs joined retirees holding professionally printed banners. The diversity of the crowd was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, a visual representation that this issue affected the entire community, not just veterans and their families. The coalition had spent weeks training volunteers in nonviolent protest tactics. Sarah insisted on strict discipline. Any violence or property damage would undermine their moral authority and hand their opponents an easy victory. Everyone understood the rules. Stay on public property, obey police instructions, keep the message focused, and maintain dignity even in the face of provocation. Sarah had seen too many righteous causes destroyed by a few minutes of bad judgment. Local news crews had been alerted and were already setting up their equipment. Sarah had cultivated relationships with several reporters who understood the importance of the story beyond just the spectacle of the protest. The morning news shows had mentioned the planned demonstration, and social media was buzzing with supporters sharing information about the event. This was exactly the kind of community engagement that Sarah lived for, people caring enough about an issue to take action. The police presence was minimal but professional. Sergeant Davis, the protest liaison officer, had worked with Sarah on previous demonstrations and understood that her group posed no threat to public safety. The understanding was simple. As long as the protesters stayed in designated areas and followed permit conditions, the police would ensure their right to peaceful assembly. Sarah appreciated this professional relationship, understanding that antagonizing law enforcement would serve no one's interests. As the crowd swelled to nearly 200 people by mid-morning, Sarah felt the familiar surge of energy that came with successful organizing. The intersection was filling with passionate voices demanding justice for those who had served their country. What Sarah didn't know was that 12 blocks away, a funeral procession was beginning its solemn journey through downtown, carrying a fallen soldier toward his final resting place. Two groups with profound respect for veterans were about to collide in the most unlikely and devastating way possible. The funeral procession pulled away from Rodriguez family funeral services at exactly 11:30 a.m., as precise as any military operation Marcus had ever conducted. The hearse led the convoy with its solemn dignity, followed by 12 vehicles carrying the Chun family, honor guard members, and close friends. Each driver had been briefed on the route, the speed to maintain, and the protocol for staying together as a unified procession. Marcus watched his mirrors constantly, ensuring that no one fell behind as they made their way through the quieter residential streets toward downtown. Behind the wheel of the hearse, Marcus felt the familiar calm that came with executing a well-planned mission. The route to Arlington Memorial Cemetery would take them through the heart of downtown San Antonio, past the historic buildings and busy intersections that marked the city's commercial center. Traffic was lighter than usual for a Tuesday, which Marcus took as a good sign. The last thing the Chun family needed was their son's final journey delayed by construction or accidents. In the lead family car, Tommy's mother clutched a folded American flag, not the one that would be presented to her at the cemetery, but one that Tommy had carried during his deployment to Iraq. She'd insisted on bringing it, saying she wanted something of Tommy's service to accompany him on this last trip. Maria sat beside her, still wearing the engagement ring Tommy had managed to slip onto her finger during his final hours in the hospital. The two women had barely spoken during the ride, each lost in their own grief and memories. The honor guard followed in a military van, 7 soldiers in dress uniforms who would carry Tommy to his final resting place. These weren't ceremonial soldiers, but active-duty personnel from Tommy's own unit, men who had served with him and genuinely mourned his loss. Sergeant Martinez, the detail leader, had served 2 deployments with Tommy and considered him a younger brother. For these soldiers, today's ceremony wasn't just duty, it was personal. As the procession approached downtown, Marcus began encountering the first signs of unusual traffic patterns. Cars were backed up at several intersections, and he could see drivers looking frustrated as they waited longer than normal at traffic lights. Through his radio, he heard chatter from the police escort about some kind of gathering downtown, but the details were unclear. Marcus made a mental note to stay flexible with the route if necessary, but remained confident in his planning. The intersection of Commerce and Broadway came into view as the procession turned onto Commerce Street. Marcus immediately saw what was causing the traffic delays. A large crowd of protesters had filled the intersection and spilled onto the surrounding sidewalks. Signs and banners were visible above the crowd, and the sound of chanting voices carried over the normal city noise. Marcus's first thought was professional. This was exactly the kind of unexpected obstacle that could disrupt a funeral procession. Marcus slowed the hearse as he approached the intersection, hoping to see a clear path through or around the demonstration. The protesters appeared to be concentrated in the center of the intersection, with police maintaining a perimeter that kept some traffic lanes open. But as Marcus drew closer, it became apparent that the crowd was larger and more spread out than it had initially appeared. What had looked like a manageable delay was turning into a significant obstacle. The lead police escort motorcycle attempted to clear a path through the intersection, but the protesters seemed unaware of the approaching funeral procession. The officers' efforts to create a corridor were met with confused resistance from demonstrators who assumed this was just another attempt by authorities to disrupt their permitted assembly. Voices were raised, gestures were exchanged, and the gap between the protesters and the procession began to close rather than open. Behind Marcus, the family vehicles began to compress as the procession slowed to a crawl. He could see in his mirrors that Tommy's mother was leaning forward, trying to understand what was happening. The honor guard van had stopped completely, its occupants alert and professional, but clearly assessing the developing situation. This was not part of the plan, and everyone in the procession understood that they were entering uncharted territory. Marcus brought the hearse to a complete stop about 50 yards from the intersection, close enough to see individual protesters, but far enough back to maintain some tactical distance. Through his windshield, he could observe the dynamics of the crowd, passionate but peaceful, organized but not militant, committed to their cause but not inherently hostile. These weren't troublemakers looking for confrontation. They were citizens exercising their constitutional rights. The problem was that their location made it impossible for the funeral procession to continue on its planned route. The radio crackled with updates from the police escorts. The protest was legal and permitted. The crowd was cooperative but large, and there was no clear timeline for when the intersection might be reopened to normal traffic. Alternative routes were being explored, but downtown's one-way streets and ongoing construction made options limited. Marcus found himself facing the kind of tactical decision he'd hoped to avoid. Wait for the situation to resolve itself, attempt to negotiate passage, or find an alternative route that might add significant time and complexity to the procession. In the family car behind him, David Chun was growing agitated. As a veteran himself, he understood the importance of precision and timing in military ceremonies. Delays were more than inconveniences. They were signs of disrespect, indications that his son's sacrifice wasn't being treated with the gravity it deserved. Maria was asking questions that no one could answer. How long would they wait? What were all those people protesting? Why couldn't they just move aside for a funeral? Marcus made his decision with the same calm deliberation he'd used in Afghanistan when facing unexpected obstacles. He would attempt direct communication with the protest organizers, explain the situation, and request passage for the funeral procession. It was a reasonable approach that respected both the protesters' rights and the Chun family's need to honor their son. What Marcus couldn't know was that he was about to encounter people whose passion for their own cause would initially blind them to the significance of his mission, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test everything he'd learned about leadership under pressure. Marcus Rodriguez stepped out of the hearse with the measured precision of a man who had learned to control his emotions under pressure. The late morning sun reflected off his polished black shoes as he walked toward the intersection, his funeral director's jacket immaculate despite the rising tension in the air. Behind him, 12 vehicles sat idling in perfect formation, their occupants watching through tinted windows as their convoy leader approached what appeared to be an immovable obstacle. The crowd of protesters had swelled to nearly 300 people, their voices creating a steady hum of organized chanting that echoed off the downtown buildings. Signs demanding justice for veterans bobbed above the crowd like a forest of righteous indignation. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Marcus. Here are people fighting for veterans' rights, unknowingly blocking a veteran's funeral procession. But irony wouldn't get Tommy Chun to his final resting place on time. Sarah Winters stood near the center of the intersection, a megaphone in one hand and her clipboard in the other, orchestrating the demonstration with the skill of a conductor leading a symphony. She was in her element, energized by the crowd's passion and the knowledge that their message was being heard. Local news crews had arrived and were filming the protest, which meant their cause was reaching beyond the intersection to living rooms across the city. This was exactly the kind of visibility the Coalition for Veteran Justice needed. Marcus approached the police perimeter, where Sergeant Davis was attempting to manage an increasingly complex situation. The officer looked relieved to see a figure of obvious authority approaching from the stalled procession. "Sir, I've been trying to explain to the protest organizers that you need passage, but they're not budging," Davis explained, gesturing towards Sarah's position in the crowd. "They've got a valid permit for the intersection until 2 p.m., and they're not required to accommodate traffic." "I understand their rights, Sergeant," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the calm authority of his military background. "But we've got a fallen soldier who needs to get to Arlington Memorial Cemetery. This isn't about convenience. This is about honoring a young man who died serving his country." Marcus's words carried weight that went beyond his funeral director credentials. Davis nodded, recognizing something in Marcus's bearing that spoke of shared experience and mutual respect. Sarah noticed the official-looking conversation taking place at the police line and made her way over, still carrying her megaphone and trailing several corps organizers. She approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to dealing with authority figures who wanted to shut down her protests. In her experience, officials who appeared during demonstrations usually brought ultimatums and threats, not reasonable requests for accommodation. "I'm Sarah Winters, coordinator of the Coalition for Veteran Justice," she announced, extending her hand to Marcus with professional courtesy but obvious wariness. "If this is about moving our legal protest, I need to remind you that we have proper permits and constitutional rights. We're not blocking traffic. We're exercising our right to peaceful assembly on behalf of veterans who are being abandoned by this city." Marcus accepted her handshake, noting the firmness of her grip and the steel in her eyes. This wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated or dismissed. "Ma'am, I'm Marcus Rodriguez from Rodriguez Family Funeral Services. I appreciate what you're fighting for, and I support veterans' rights completely. But right now, I got Sergeant Tommy Chun in my hearse, and his family needs to get him to the cemetery for his funeral. I'm asking for 10 minutes to let our procession pass through." Sarah's expression shifted slightly as she processed Marcus's words, but her resolve didn't waver. "I'm sorry for your loss and the family's grief, but we can't just stop our protest every time someone claims they have an emergency. We've seen every excuse in the book from people trying to disrupt our demonstrations. If this is really a funeral procession, where are the flowers? Where are the funeral home markers? This looks like regular traffic to me." The challenge in Sarah's voice triggered something in Marcus. Not anger, but a deeper sense of urgency about his mission. "Ma'am, if you'll look at the vehicles behind me, you'll see they're all black, traveling in formation with escort vehicles. That hearse contains a 28-year-old soldier who was killed in a training accident at Fort Hood. His parents, his fiancée, and his honor guard are waiting to lay him to rest with the dignity he earned through his service." Sarah glanced toward the line of vehicles, noting for the first time their uniformity and formal arrangement. But her activist instincts, honed through months of dealing with authorities who used every possible tactic to undermine their protests, kept her skeptical. "Even if that's true, we have a legal right to this intersection. We've been planning this protest for weeks. We have all the proper permits, and hundreds of people have taken time off work to be here. We're fighting for veterans who are alive and need services right now." Miguel Rodriguez, Sarah's second-in-command, moved closer to the conversation, his own military bearing evident in his posture. As a Gulf War veteran, he was torn between supporting Sarah's leadership and feeling uncomfortable about potentially interfering with a military funeral. "Sarah, maybe we could," he began, but she cut him off with a sharp look that reminded everyone present who was in charge of this operation. "We've worked too hard and come too far to be moved aside because someone shows up claiming an emergency," Sarah continued, her voice rising slightly as other protesters gathered around the conversation. "This is exactly the kind of disruption we've been told to expect. First it's a funeral, then it's an ambulance, then it's some other excuse. Our permit is valid until 2 p.m., and we're staying until 2 p.m. Marcus felt the situation sliding away from reasonable negotiation toward confrontation. Behind him, he could see David Chun getting out of the family car, his face showing the strain of watching his son's funeral turn into a bureaucratic standoff. The honor guard remained disciplined in their van, but Marcus knew they were assessing the situation and waiting for direction. Time was becoming a factor, not just for the cemetery schedule, but for the emotional well-being of a grieving family who deserved better than this chaos. "Ms. Winters," Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of finality, "I'm going to ask you one more time to allow this funeral procession to pass. After that, I'll need to explore other options, and I don't think anyone here wants this situation to escalate unnecessarily." Marcus Rodriguez felt the familiar shift in his mental state that had kept him alive through 2 combat deployments, the moment when diplomacy ended and tactical thinking took over. Standing in the middle of Commerce Street, surrounded by passionate protesters and increasingly agitated family members, Marcus began assessing the situation with the cold precision of a soldier evaluating battlefield conditions. The mission remained unchanged: get Sergeant Tommy Chun to Arlington Memorial Cemetery with the honor and dignity he deserved. The obstacles had simply become more complex. Behind him, David Chun had stepped out of the family car and was walking toward the confrontation with the rigid posture of a man barely containing his rage. As a Vietnam veteran, David understood military protocol and the sacred nature of funeral ceremonies. Watching his son's final journey turn into a political standoff was pushing him toward a breaking point that Marcus recognized and needed to prevent. The last thing this situation required was an angry father escalating tensions with grieving outbursts. "Mr. Chun, please get back in the vehicle," Marcus called over his shoulder, his voice carrying the authority of command without losing its respectful tone. "I'm handling this situation, and I need you to trust me to get Tommy home properly." David hesitated, his fists clenched at his sides, but something in Marcus's bearing convinced him to step back. The funeral director had transformed from a service provider into a military leader, and David's instincts told him to follow that leadership. Sarah Winters stood her ground in the intersection, surrounded by her core organizers and energized by the growing crowd of supporters who had gathered around the confrontation. From her perspective, this was exactly the kind of test that would define her movement's credibility. If they backed down every time someone presented them with an emotional appeal, they would never accomplish their mission of restoring funding for veteran services. The cause was bigger than any individual situation, even one involving a funeral. "We're not moving," Sarah announced loudly enough for the crowd to hear, raising her megaphone to amplify her voice. "We have a legal right to be here. We're fighting for veterans who are alive and need help right now, and we won't be intimidated into abandoning our mission." The crowd responded with cheers and renewed chanting, their energy feeding off the dramatic confrontation unfolding in their midst. Marcus studied the crowd dynamics with tactical awareness, noting the layout of the intersection, the positions of police officers, and the alternative routes that might be available. 3 years of convoy operations in Afghanistan had taught him to always have multiple exit strategies, to never put all his operational eggs in one tactical basket. But the downtown street grid offered limited options, and each alternative route would add significant time and complexity to the procession. The police presence was minimal and deliberately non-confrontational. Sergeant Davis had radioed for additional units, but department policy discouraged heavy-handed tactics with peaceful protesters. The officers on scene were caught between competing legal obligations, protecting the protesters' constitutional rights while facilitating the legitimate needs of the funeral procession. There was no clear precedent for this exact situation, no training manual that covered the intersection of civil protest and military honors. Marcus's radio crackled with updates from his staff back at the funeral home. Other families were asking about delays to their own services. Media inquiries were pouring in as word of the standoff spread through social networks, and the cemetery director was calling to discuss schedule adjustments. Each update reminded Marcus that this confrontation was spiraling beyond a simple traffic delay into a public spectacle that could damage his reputation and the dignity of Tommy's funeral. Behind the protest lines, Maria had gotten out of the family car and was standing beside the hearse, her hand resting on the polished black surface that contained her fiancé's body. The sight of Tommy's girlfriend maintaining her vigil while strangers debated their right to pass struck several protesters as particularly poignant. Some began to question whether their cause justified blocking a young woman's final goodbye to her fallen soldier. But Sarah's leadership kept them focused on a larger political battle. Miguel Rodriguez, Sarah's lieutenant and fellow veteran, was experiencing his own internal conflict as he watched the situation unfold. His military service had instilled deep respect for funeral ceremonies and military honors, but his commitment to the Coalition for Veteran Justice kept him loyal to Sarah's strategic decisions. The tension between these competing loyalties was visible in his increasingly uncomfortable body language as he stood near Sarah's position. Marcus decided to attempt one final diplomatic solution before exploring more direct options. He approached Sarah again, this time carrying a folder containing Tommy's military records and funeral documentation. "Ms. Winters, I want you to see exactly who we're trying to honor today," he said, opening the folder to reveal Tommy's service record, deployment photos, and Purple Heart citation. Sergeant Chun served 2 tours in Iraq, earned multiple decorations, and died in service to his country. His family has been planning this funeral for a week, and they deserve to see their son laid to rest with dignity. Sarah glanced at the documents, noting their official appearance and detailed content, but her activist training kept her skeptical of emotional appeals designed to undermine her position. "Mr. Rodriguez, I don't doubt this soldier's service or sacrifice, but we're fighting for thousands of veterans who are being denied services they've earned. We can't let individual tragedy derail systemic change. If you're really concerned about honoring veterans, you should support our cause instead of asking us to abandon it." The philosophical divide between immediate honor and long-term advocacy was becoming clear to everyone present. Marcus represented the traditional military values of individual recognition and ceremonial dignity. Sarah embodied the activist belief that systemic change required unwavering commitment to larger principles, even when individual cases tugged at heartstrings. Neither position was inherently wrong, but they were fundamentally incompatible in this specific moment. Marcus's patience, legendary among families who had experienced his services during their darkest hours, was approaching its limits. The military training that taught him to maintain composure under fire was being tested by the unique frustration of watching a sacred ceremony become a political battleground. Every minute of delay was another minute that Tommy's family spent in anguish, another minute that the honor guard sat in formation waiting for orders, another minute that the cemetery schedule fell further behind. The crowd had grown larger as word of the confrontation spread through social media and local news coverage. Passers-by stopped to watch the drama unfold, some supporting the protesters and others expressing sympathy for the funeral procession. The intersection was becoming a stage for competing narratives about patriotism, civil rights, and the proper way to honor military service. What had started as a simple request for passage was evolving into a public debate about values and priorities. Marcus made a decision that would define not only this moment, but his entire approach to leadership under pressure. He would give Sarah Winters and her protesters one final opportunity to do the right thing voluntarily. After that, he would implement a solution that honored both Tommy's memory and his own oath to complete every mission successfully. The boy who had volunteered to serve his country deserved better than becoming a footnote in someone else's political protest, and Marcus Rodriguez was going to ensure he received the farewell he had earned through his sacrifice. Marcus Rodriguez walked back to the hearse with the deliberate pace of a man who had made an irrevocable decision. The crowd watched him approach the polished black vehicle, some protesters assuming he was retreating in defeat, others sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Marcus opened the rear door of the hearse and retrieved a folded American flag. Not the one that would be presented to Tommy's mother, but his own service flag from Afghanistan, carried in every funeral as a reminder of his own oath to honor the fallen. He returned to the center of the intersection, flag in hand, and positioned himself directly in front of Sarah Winters and her corps organizers. The crowd's chanting began to fade as people noticed the change in Marcus's demeanor and the symbolic weight of the flag he carried. Even those who didn't understand military protocol recognized that something important was happening, that the dynamics of the confrontation were shifting in ways none of them had anticipated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying without amplification across the intersection. Years of addressing grieving families had taught him how to project authority and compassion simultaneously, how to command attention through presence rather than volume. "My name is Marcus Rodriguez. I'm a United States Army veteran, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and I'm the funeral director trying to bring Sergeant Tommy Chin home." The intersection fell silent except for the distant hum of city traffic and the clicking of news cameras capturing the moment. Sarah lowered her megaphone, suddenly aware that she was facing something more complex than the typical authority figure trying to disrupt her protest. The mention of Afghanistan and military service changed the calculus of the confrontation, introducing elements that her activist training hadn't prepared her to handle. Marcus continued, his voice steady and clear. "Sergeant Chun was 28 years old when he died in a training accident at Fort Hood 5 days ago. He served 2 tours in Iraq, earned a Purple Heart and 3 Bronze Stars, and was planning to propose to his girlfriend when he came home from training. His parents are sitting in that car behind me, watching their son's funeral turn into a political theater, and I won't let that happen." He held up the flag, letting it unfold slightly in the downtown breeze. "This flag flew over my forward operating base in Helmand Province. It covered the caskets of 3 soldiers I served with who didn't make it home. Today, it's riding with Tommy Chun because every veteran who dies deserves to be escorted by brothers who understand the weight of service and sacrifice." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as Marcus's words resonated through the crowd. Several protesters were looking uncomfortable, and she could see doubt creeping into the faces of her core organizers. Miguel Rodriguez was staring at Marcus with undisguised recognition, one veteran acknowledging another across the political divide that had temporarily separated them. "I understand what you're fighting for," Marcus continued, his gaze moving across the crowd, but always returning to Sarah. "Veteran services, mental health support, the programs that keep our brothers and sisters alive when they come home broken. I support those causes because I've seen what happens when veterans don't get the help they need. But right now, in this moment, we're not talking about policy or politics. We're talking about a young man who answered his country's call and deserves to reach his final resting place with dignity." The crowd was beginning to fracture as Marcus's words created cognitive dissonance between their cause and their current actions. These were people who had gathered to support veterans, not to block a veteran's funeral. The irony was becoming impossible to ignore, and Sarah could feel her authority over the situation slipping away with each word Marcus spoke. "Sergeant Chin's mother is holding the flag that covered his casket when it came home from Dover Air Force Base," Marcus said, gesturing toward the family cars. "His fiancée is wearing the engagement ring he managed to give her during his last hours in the hospital. His honor guard consists of soldiers from his own unit who served with him in Iraq and consider him their brother. These people trusted me to bring Tommy home with honor, and I've never failed to complete a mission." Sarah attempted to regain control of the narrative. "Mr. Rodriguez, I respect your service, and I'm sorry for Sergeant Chin's family, but thousands of living veterans are being denied services because of the City Council's cuts. We can't let individual tragedy override the systematic change that will save lives. Your soldier is beyond help, but the veterans we're fighting for still have a chance." The words came out wrong, harsher and more callous than Sarah had intended. The crowd reacted with visible shock at the phrase, "beyond help," and several protesters began backing away from Sarah's position. Miguel Rodriguez shook his head in dismay, recognizing that his leader had just made a catastrophic political and moral error in front of cameras and witnesses. Marcus didn't raise his voice or show anger, but his response carried the weight of absolute moral authority. "Ma'am, no fallen soldier is ever beyond help as long as there are veterans alive to honor their memory. Tommy Chun gave his life in service to this country, and every day we fail to honor that sacrifice is a day we dishonor every veteran, living or dead." He turned to address the broader crowd, many of whom were now openly questioning their participation in blocking the funeral. I serve alongside soldiers like Tommy Chan in Afghanistan. I watched them risk their lives for missions they believed in, for brothers they loved, for a country they swore to defend. Some of them came home, and some of them didn't. The ones who didn't make it home trusted us to remember them, to honor them, to ensure their sacrifice meant something. The emotional impact of Marcus's words was amplified by his obvious sincerity and the symbolic power of his military bearing. This wasn't a politician making calculated appeals or an authority figure demanding obedience. This was a veteran speaking truth about service and sacrifice to people who had gathered to support veterans but found themselves inadvertently dishonoring one. Tommy's father served in Vietnam. Marcus continued. He knows what it means to come home to a country that doesn't always appreciate your service. He's watching his son's funeral right now, wondering if the same country Tommy died for is going to deny him even the basic dignity of a proper burial procession. Sarah looked around the intersection and saw her carefully orchestrated protest dissolving into confusion and moral uncertainty. Media cameras were focused on Marcus rather than her message. Protesters were questioning their leadership, and the narrative had shifted completely away from veteran services toward veteran honor. Every instinct told her to maintain her position, to stick to the strategic plan regardless of emotional appeals, but the ground was crumbling beneath her feet. Miguel Rodriguez made the decision that Sarah couldn't bring herself to make. He stepped forward and addressed Marcus directly. "Brother, we didn't know. This whole thing got out of hand, and we lost sight of what really matters. How can we make this right?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline thrown across a widening chasm. Marcus looked at Miguel with the recognition that passes between veterans, seeing past the political differences to the shared understanding of duty and honor. In that moment, the possibility emerged for something unprecedented: enemies becoming allies in service of a higher cause. The video of Marcus Rodriguez's speech began spreading across social media platforms before he had even finished speaking. Someone in the crowd had started live streaming the confrontation, and now thousands of viewers were watching in real time as a funeral director explained why a protest was blocking a veteran's funeral. The comments section exploded with outrage, support, confusion, and calls for the protesters to clear the intersection immediately. Jennifer Park, one of Sarah's core organizers, was the first to notice her phone buzzing with notifications from friends and family who had seen the video. "Sarah," she whispered urgently, pulling her leader aside, "this is going viral. People are sharing the video everywhere, and the comments are not good for us." Jennifer showed Sarah her phone screen, where angry messages were pouring in from supporters who felt betrayed by the coalition's apparent insensitivity to a military funeral. Local news crews, initially focused on covering a routine protest about veteran services, suddenly found themselves documenting a human interest story with national implications. Channel 7's reporter, Amanda Walsh, was already doing a live broadcast describing the unprecedented confrontation between veteran rights activists and a military funeral procession. Her camera operator had captured Marcus's entire speech, and the footage was being fed directly to the station's social media accounts, where it was being shared exponentially. The ripple effects extended beyond social media into the veteran community throughout San Antonio and beyond. At VFW Post 628, morning coffee was interrupted as members gathered around a television showing the developing story. "That's Marcus Rodriguez," said Frank Castellanos, a Vietnam veteran who had used Marcus's services for his brother's funeral 2 years earlier. "Best damn funeral director in the city, and a hell of a soldier. If he says this is wrong, then it's wrong." Similar conversations were happening at American Legion halls, VA medical centers, and military installations across South Texas. The veteran community operates on informal networks of communication that can mobilize faster than any official organization, and word was spreading that one of their own needed support. Phones began ringing as veterans called each other, asking if they'd seen the video and whether they could get downtown to help. At Lackland Air Force Base, Master Sergeant Patricia Coleman was showing the video to her unit during a break in training. "This is what we're talking about when we discuss honor and respect," she told the young airman gathered around her laptop. That funeral director understands something that those protesters missed. Sometimes individual dignity matters more than collective action. 3 of her airmen asked permission to leave base and join any response that might be organizing. The protest crowd was becoming increasingly divided as more people learned the full context of what they were blocking. Linda Martinez, whose disabled veteran husband had brought her to the protest, found herself torn between loyalty to Sarah's leadership and horror at the idea of preventing a military funeral. "I came here to fight for my husband's benefits," she told the woman standing next to her, "but I can't be part of stopping another veteran from getting buried properly." Sarah watched her carefully orchestrated demonstration disintegrating in real time as protesters began leaving the intersection. Some were making apologetic gestures toward the funeral procession as they departed, while others gathered in confused clusters, trying to understand how their righteous cause had become a public relations nightmare. The unified voice that had been chanting for veteran services was fragmenting into dozens of individual consciences grappling with unexpected moral complexity. Miguel Rodriguez was experiencing his own crisis of conscience as he watched Marcus maintain his dignified composure despite the chaos surrounding him. As a Gulf War veteran, Miguel understood military protocol and the sacred nature of funeral ceremonies in ways that transcended political activism. "Sarah, we need to end this now," he said firmly. "This isn't what we signed up for, and it's not what our cause stands for." The downtown business district was also taking notice as employees gathered at windows overlooking the intersection. Office workers who had initially been annoyed by the traffic disruption were now following the drama with fascination and growing sympathy for the funeral procession. Several businesses began posting supportive messages on their social media accounts, calling for the protesters to allow the funeral to proceed. At Rodriguez Family Funeral Services, the phone was ringing constantly as other funeral directors, veterans organizations, and community leaders called to offer support. Marcus's assistant, Elena Vasquez, was taking messages from people who wanted to help but weren't sure how. "Tell them we appreciate the support," she instructed her staff. "But Mr. Rodriguez has this situation under control." The Chun family was watching the developments with a mixture of hope and continued anguish. David Chun had rolled down his window and could hear fragments of Marcus's speech carried on the downtown breeze. For the first time since the procession had been stopped, he felt a glimmer of confidence that his son's funeral director truly understood the stakes involved and was fighting for Tommy's honor with the same intensity that David himself felt. Tommy's fiancée, Maria, was recording everything on her phone, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps she wanted to remember how Marcus had stood up for Tommy when it mattered most, or perhaps she needed documentation of this surreal delay in saying goodbye to the man she had planned to marry. The engagement ring on her finger caught the sunlight as she held the phone steady, a reminder of promises that would never be fulfilled. Inside the honor guard van, Sergeant Martinez and his soldiers maintained their military bearing while watching their convoy leader handle an impossible situation with tactical precision. These were active-duty soldiers trained for combat operations, but none of their military training had prepared them for the delicate diplomacy required to navigate civilian protests while preserving the dignity of their fallen brother's funeral. The crowd's energy was shifting palpably as Marcus's moral authority resonated with people who had come to support veterans but found themselves inadvertently opposing one. The cognitive dissonance was becoming impossible to ignore, and Sarah could see her movement fracturing along lines of individual conscience versus collective action. The protest that had begun with such clear purpose and unified energy was dissolving into confusion and doubt as the human cost of their tactical position became undeniably clear. The first motorcycle appeared on Commerce Street at 12:47 p.m., its Harley-Davidson engine rumbling like distant thunder as it navigated through the backed-up traffic toward the intersection. Behind a rider's leather vest, the patches told a story. Vietnam Veterans of America, Purple Heart recipient, Patriot Guard riders. Within minutes, 2 more motorcycles joined him, then 5, then a dozen, as the veteran community's informal communication network mobilized faster than any official emergency response. Frank Castellanos had made the decision to close his auto repair shop early after seeing Marcus's speech on social media. At 73, the Vietnam veteran still rode his 1995 Heritage Softail with the confidence of a man who had navigated far more dangerous terrain than downtown San Antonio traffic. He'd called 6 members of his VFW post, who had called 6 more, creating an exponential mobilization that brought veterans from across the metro area converging on the intersection. The visual impact was immediate and dramatic. These weren't young soldiers in dress uniforms, but weathered men and women whose service spanned from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Undeniable moral clarity. The first crack in the protest solidarity came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Park, one of Sarah's most trusted organizers, lowered her sign and quietly stepped back from the center of the intersection. As a social worker who had spent years helping veterans navigate the complex system of benefits and services, she understood both the importance of their cause and the sacred nature of military funerals. The cognitive dissonance had become too much to bear. "I can't do this anymore," Jennifer whispered to the protester standing next to her, a college student who had joined the demonstration after reading about veteran service cuts on social media. "We're supposed to be helping veterans, not preventing them from being buried with dignity." Her words carried to several nearby protesters, creating a ripple effect of doubt and self-reflection that began spreading through the crowd like water through cracks in concrete. Miguel Rodriguez watched Jennifer's departure with recognition that the moment he had been dreading had finally arrived. As Sarah's lieutenant and fellow veteran, he had tried to balance loyalty to their cause with respect for military traditions, but the arrival of so many veterans in support of the funeral had made that balance impossible to maintain. The sight of Frank Castellanos and other Vietnam veterans standing in solidarity with Marcus Rodriguez had triggered memories of his own homecoming and the brotherhood that transcended political differences. Sarah noticed the defections beginning and attempted to rally her remaining supporters with renewed urgency. "Don't let them manipulate you with emotional appeals," she called out through her megaphone. "We came here to fight for living veterans who need our help right now. If we abandon our mission every time someone presents us with a heartbreaking story, we'll never accomplish the systemic change that will save lives." But her words felt hollow even to her own ears, competing with the visual evidence of veterans united in support of honoring their fallen brother. The psychological turning point came when Staff Sergeant Elena Martinez stepped forward from the group of arriving veterans. She was a Iraq War veteran who had lost her left leg to an IED, but continued serving as a counselor at the VA Medical Center. Her presence in uniform, walking with visible difficulty but unmistakable dignity, created a powerful contrast to the healthy protesters who were blocking a dead soldier's funeral. When she approached the protest line, several demonstrators stepped aside without being asked. "I'm Elena Martinez," she announced in a voice trained to counsel troubled veterans through their darkest moments. "I served 2 tours in Iraq, and I work at the VA helping veterans get the services they need. I support your cause about funding cuts, but I can't support blocking this funeral. Some things are bigger than politics, and honoring our dead is one of them." Her words carried the moral authority of someone who had literally bled for her country and continued serving veterans in civilian life. Miguel Rodriguez made his decision in that moment, stepping away from Sarah's position and walking toward the group of veterans. "Elena's right," he said loudly enough for both protesters and veterans to hear. "We lost sight of what really matters here. This isn't about politics anymore. It's about basic human decency." His defection was particularly devastating because it came from within Sarah's core leadership, validating the doubts that other protesters had been feeling. The remaining protesters found themselves increasingly isolated as more of their number quietly departed. Linda Martinez, whose disabled veteran husband had brought her to the demonstration, was crying as she walked toward the veteran group. "I'm sorry," she said to Marcus Rodriguez, her voice breaking. "We never meant for this to happen. We just wanted to help veterans, not hurt them." Her apology seemed to speak for many of the protesters who had joined the demonstration with good intentions, but found themselves on the wrong side of a moral equation they hadn't anticipated. Sarah watched her carefully orchestrated protest dissolving with a mixture of anger and desperation. Months of planning, weeks of organizing, hundreds of volunteer hours, all crumbling because of one funeral director's speech and the veteran community's response. She had built the Coalition for Veteran Justice from nothing, had created a movement that was making real progress on important issues, and now it was being destroyed by what she still viewed as emotional manipulation designed to undermine legitimate political action. Marcus Rodriguez observed the changing dynamics with the tactical awareness of a soldier and the psychological insight of someone who had spent years helping families navigate their most difficult moments. He could see that Sarah was approaching her own breaking point, torn between maintaining her leadership position and acknowledging the moral reality that her supporters were abandoning. This was the moment that would define not just the immediate situation, but the long-term relationship between veteran advocacy and veteran honor. The media coverage was capturing every moment of the protest dissolution, with reporters recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the intersection of civil rights and military tradition. Amanda Walsh was providing live commentary as protesters continued leaving the intersection. What we're seeing here is really extraordinary. A grassroots political movement essentially dissolving in real time as its participants grapple with the unexpected moral complexity of their position. Frank Castellanos approached Miguel Rodriguez with the recognition that passes between veterans who have found common ground despite surface differences. "Brother, I know this is hard, but you made the right choice," the Vietnam veteran said. "Sometimes doing what's right means standing up to your own side." The handshake between the two men symbolized the possibility of unity across generational and political lines when fundamental values were at stake. The Chin family was watching the transformation with amazement and growing hope. David Chun had served in an era when veterans were often treated with suspicion or hostility upon returning home, and seeing so many people willing to stand up for his son's dignity reminded him of the brotherhood that had sustained him through his own difficult times. Maria continued to hold Tommy's photograph, but now she was surrounded by strangers who understood her loss and were committed to ensuring her fiancé received the honors he deserved. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward evening, the intersection that had been filled with protesters an hour earlier was now dominated by veterans united in common purpose. Sarah Winters stood nearly alone in the center of the street, still holding her megaphone, but no longer having anyone to lead. The moment of decision was approaching when she would have to choose between doubling down on a losing position or finding a way to salvage dignity from defeat. Sarah Winters stood alone in the center of the intersection, her megaphone hanging at her side like a decommissioned weapon, watching the last of her supporters drift away toward the growing circle of veterans. The Coalition for Veteran Justice that she had built from passionate conviction and months of hard work was dissolving before her eyes, not because of government pressure or media manipulation, but because of a fundamental moral reckoning that she had never anticipated. The weight of leadership had become unbearable when the cause she was leading collided with the values it was supposed to represent. Marcus Rodriguez remained positioned near the hearse, still holding his Afghanistan service flag, but his posture had shifted from confrontational to receptive. He recognized the psychological moment when an opponent transitions from resistance to acceptance, and Sarah was clearly approaching that critical juncture. His military training had taught him the importance of offering honorable surrender to defeated enemies, and his experience as a funeral director had shown him how people could find dignity even in their darkest moments. The veteran crowd watched Sarah with a mixture of sympathy and expectation, understanding that she was facing a decision that would define not only the immediate situation, but her future credibility as an advocate for veteran causes. Frank Castellanos whispered to Miguel Rodriguez, "That woman's about to make the hardest decision of her life. Let's see if she's got the character to do what's right." The comment carried the respect of one veteran for another facing a moment of truth under pressure. Sarah looked toward the funeral procession, seeing for the first time not just vehicles blocking her protest, but a grieving family whose son deserved better than becoming a casualty of political activism. Maria was still standing beside the hearse, holding Tommy's photograph, her presence a constant reminder of the human cost of delay. The sight of this young woman maintaining her vigil while strangers debated her right to bury her fiancé struck Sarah with devastating clarity about what her leadership had become. The decision crystallized in a moment of moral exhaustion and ethical recognition. Sarah walked slowly toward Marcus, each step feeling like an acknowledgement of defeat, but also a movement toward redemption. The intersection fell silent, except for the distant hum of city traffic and the clicking of news cameras documenting what everyone sensed was a pivotal moment in the confrontation. "Mr. Rodriguez," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had wrestled with her conscience and found it wanting, "I owe you and Sergeant Chin's family an apology. We came here to fight for veterans, but we lost sight of what that really means. Tommy Chun served his country and died in that service, and he deserves to be honored properly. We're going to clear the intersection immediately." Marcus accepted her words with the grace of someone who understood that admitting error required more courage than maintaining a failed position. "Ms. Winters, I appreciate your apology, and I know it wasn't easy to make that decision. Your cause is important, and veterans need advocates like you fighting for their services. Today just wasn't the right time or place for that fight." Sarah turned to address the remaining protesters and the growing crowd of veterans, raising her megaphone one final time. "The Coalition for Veteran Justice is officially ending this demonstration," she announced, her voice steady despite the personal cost of the admission. "We came here to support veterans, and we've learned that sometimes supporting veterans means stepping aside so they can honor their fallen brothers. Please clear the intersection immediately and allow Sergeant Chin's funeral procession to continue." The response was immediate and remarkable. Veterans who had arrived to support the funeral began helping protesters gather their signs and equipment, creating an unprecedented scene of former opponents working together to restore dignity to the situation. Miguel Rodriguez organized a group to quickly dismantle the sound system and fold the banners, while Frank Castellanos directed traffic to ensure the intersection would be completely clear within minutes. Jennifer Park approached Maria with tears in her eyes, extending her hand in a gesture of solidarity and regret. "I'm so sorry for your loss and for what we put you through today," she said. "Your fiancé was a hero, and he deserves all the honors we can give him." Maria accepted the apology with the exhausted grace of someone who had endured more emotional trauma in one day than most people experience in months. But her response carried no bitterness, only gratitude that the ordeal was finally ending. The transformation of the intersection was swift and comprehensive. What had been a chaotic scene of competing protests became an organized demonstration of respect and efficiency as dozens of people worked together to ensure Sergeant Chin's procession could continue. Veterans directed traffic, former protesters cleared debris, and police officers coordinated the restoration of normal traffic patterns with unprecedented cooperation from all parties involved. Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of leaving the scene, she walked to the family cars and asked David Chun for permission to join the funeral procession. "Sir, if you'll allow it, I'd like to accompany your son to the cemetery, not as a protest leader, but as someone who learned today what it really means to honor veterans." David Chun, recognizing genuine remorse and respect, granted permission with the dignity of a father who understood that his son's death had taught important lessons about service and sacrifice. The news crews captured the extraordinary sight of Sarah Winters walking back to her car, not to leave but to fall in line behind the funeral procession. Other former protesters made similar decisions, transforming the convoy from 12 vehicles to nearly 30 as people who had opposed the funeral an hour earlier became part of its honor guard. The visual symbolism was powerful, enemies becoming allies in service of honoring a fallen soldier. Marcus climbed back into the hearse with a sense of mission accomplishment that went beyond simply clearing a traffic obstacle. He had navigated an impossible situation without compromising his principles, without resorting to aggression, and without dishonoring Tommy Chen's memory. The flag from Afghanistan rode beside him as the procession finally began its journey to Arlington Memorial Cemetery, now escorted by a diverse convoy that included family, veterans, former protesters, and citizens who had learned important lessons about the intersection of politics and honor. The intersection cleared completely as the expanded funeral procession pulled away, leaving only the normal flow of downtown traffic and a few scattered pieces of protest debris. But the impact of what had occurred would resonate far beyond the physical space where it happened. Social media was already buzzing with stories of transformation and redemption, of political opponents finding common ground and respect for military service, of a funeral director whose quiet dignity had accomplished what months of political advocacy could not. As the procession made its way through downtown San Antonio toward the cemetery, Marcus Rodriguez reflected on the events that had tested every skill he had learned as a soldier and civilian leader. Tommy Chun was finally going home with the honor he deserved, escorted by a community that had been divided by politics, but united by respect for service and sacrifice. The mission was nearly complete, and it had become something greater than anyone had anticipated when the day began. Arlington Memorial Cemetery had never hosted a funeral quite like the one that arrived at 2:47 p.m. on that transformative Tuesday afternoon. What had begun as a simple military burial for Sergeant Tommy Chun had evolved into something unprecedented, a procession that included not only grieving family members and honor guards, but former protesters who had learned the true meaning of veteran advocacy through confrontation and reconciliation. The convoy stretched for nearly half a mile as it wound through the cemetery's peaceful grounds toward the gravesite that had been prepared with military precision. Marcus Rodriguez brought the hearse to a stop at the designated location, parking with the same attention to detail that had characterized every aspect of his service to the Chun family. Behind him, 37 vehicles arranged themselves in respectful formation, their occupants representing a cross-section of American society united by shared respect for military sacrifice. The sight was so unusual that Cemetery Director James Morrison had called in additional staff to help coordinate what had become the largest funeral attendance in the facility's 40-year history. The honor guard from Fort Hood emerged from their van with crisp military bearing. 7 soldiers in dress uniforms whose precision movements spoke to hours of practice and profound respect for their fallen brother. Sergeant Martinez had served with Tommy in Iraq and understood that today's ceremony was more than protocol. It was a sacred trust between brothers in arms. The soldiers positioned themselves around the hearse with reverent attention, preparing to carry Tommy to his final resting place with a dignity befitting his service and sacrifice. Sarah Winters sat in her car at the back of the procession, still processing the events that had transformed her from protest leader to mourner in the span of 3 hours. The Coalition for Veteran Justice would need to be rebuilt from this moment, reconsidered and refocused around the lessons she had learned about the difference between political advocacy and personal honor. Her phone buzzed with messages from supporters and critics alike, but she ignored them all, focusing instead on the ceremony that was about to unfold. David Chun stepped from the family car with the measured pace of a Vietnam veteran who understood military ceremony and its importance in processing grief. Beside him, his wife clutched the flag that had covered Tommy's casket during transport, while Maria wore her engagement ring like a symbol of promises that would never be fulfilled but would never be forgotten. The family's dignity throughout the day's ordeal had impressed everyone who witnessed it, demonstrating the strength that military families develop through generations of service and sacrifice. Marcus supervised the transfer of Tommy's casket from Hearse to honor guard with the precision of a military operation and the compassion of someone who understood that every detail mattered to the grieving family. The flag draped over the casket had been folded and refolded until it achieved perfect symmetry, its stars and stripes representing not just national symbols, but personal commitment to ideals worth dying for. As the honor guard lifted their burden, the assembled crowd fell silent in recognition of the sacred nature of the moment. The procession from hearse to gravesite moved with choreographed dignity, led by a military chaplain whose words of comfort had been spoken over countless graves, but who understood that each ceremony was unique in its significance to those left behind. Frank Castellanos and other veterans fell in a step behind the family, their own military bearing evident, as they participated in honoring a brother they had never met, but whose service connected him to their own experiences of duty and sacrifice. Sarah found herself walking alongside Miguel Rodriguez, her former lieutenant, who had found the courage to break ranks when conscience demanded it. "You did the right thing today," she told him quietly. "I should have listened to you earlier, but I was too focused on the political battle to see the human cost." Miguel's response was gentle but firm. "We both learned something important about what it really means to serve veterans. Sometimes it means stepping aside so they can be honored properly." The graveside service began with military precision as the honor guard positioned Tommy's casket over the grave that would be his final resting place. Chaplain Williams spoke words that had comforted military families for generations, acknowledging both the magnitude of loss and the importance of remembering that Sergeant Chin's sacrifice had meaning beyond the circumstances of his death. The ceremony followed protocols established through decades of military tradition, but it carried extra weight because of the unusual circumstances that had brought so many diverse people together. The flag ceremony proceeded with flawless execution as the honor guard removed the colors from Tommy's casket and began the 13 folds that would transform the banner into a triangle suitable for presentation to his family. Each fold carried symbolic meaning, representing the original 13 colonies, the faith and honor of those who served, the remembrance of those who gave their lives for freedom. The precision of the movements spoke to countless hours of practice, but the reverence in the soldiers' faces revealed their personal investment in honoring their fallen brother. When Sergeant Martinez approached Tommy's mother with the folded flag, his words carried the weight of official protocol and personal grief. "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service." Mrs. Chun accepted the flag with trembling hands, understanding that she was receiving more than fabric. She was accepting the tangible representation of her son's commitment to something greater than himself. The rifle salute that followed echoed across the cemetery with the sharp precision of military ceremony. 3 volleys that honored not just Tommy, but all who had worn the uniform and made the ultimate sacrifice. The sound carried across the graves of other veterans who rested in Arlington Memorial, creating a moment of connection between past and present that reminded everyone present of the continuous thread of service that connected generations of American military personnel. As taps played, Maria stepped forward and placed Tommy's engagement ring on his casket, a gesture that spoke to promises kept and love that would endure beyond death. The haunting notes of the bugle call carried across the cemetery grounds, reaching not just those gathered at the gravesite, but visitors throughout the facility who paused their own remembrances to honor a fallen soldier they had never known, but whose sacrifice they understood. The formal ceremony concluded, but the informal gathering that followed demonstrated the community that had emerged from the day's events. Veterans shared stories with former protesters, explaining military traditions and the importance of ceremonial honor in processing collective grief. Sarah found herself in conversation with David Chun, apologizing again for the delay and learning about Tommy's service in Iraq, his plans for the future, his love for Maria and his family. Marcus Rodriguez stood near the hearse, watching the interactions with satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. Today's events had tested every skill he had developed as a soldier and civilian leader, but they had also demonstrated the power of dignity and patience in overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles. Tommy Chun had received the honors he deserved, and perhaps more importantly, a community had learned valuable lessons about the intersection of political advocacy and personal respect. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward evening, the assembled crowd gradually dispersed, but not before exchanging contact information and making commitments to continue supporting veteran causes in ways that honored both living needs and eternal memory. Sarah announced her intention to refocus the coalition for veteran justice around direct service to veterans rather than purely political advocacy, understanding that the most effective way to honor the dead was to serve the living with the same dedication they had shown to their country. The cemetery returned to its normal quiet as the last visitors departed, leaving Tommy Chun in the peaceful rest he had earned through his service. But the impact of his funeral would resonate far beyond Arlington Memorial, creating ripple effects through social media, veteran organizations, and activist communities that had witnessed something unprecedented. The transformation of political conflict into shared purpose through the simple but powerful recognition that some things transcend partisan differences. Marcus Rodriguez drove the empty hearse back to Rodriguez family funeral services with the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully despite unprecedented challenges. Tomorrow would bring new families, new ceremonies, new opportunities to honor those who had served. But today would be remembered as the day when a funeral director's quiet dignity had accomplished something that political speeches and protest signs could not: the unification of a divided community around shared respect for service and sacrifice.